of the key points I found sprinkled throughout the morning presenters, what they were all talking about, one really important principle of smart growth, and it's the number one principle about engaging participation of citizens and stakeholders and how truly important that is in all of our planning aspects. So I encourage you to continue to think about that aspect as the afternoon goes on. Without further ado, I would be honored to introduce to you our Assemblywoman, Mrs. Donna Lepardo, who will be introducing our afternoon speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. And it's so nice to be here with so many representatives from different constituencies across our community, people from different organizations and different age groups and different interests, all coming together to have this very, very important conversation. Before I thank the Livable Communities Alliance for their efforts, I want to personally thank this hotel for their commitment to our community and to providing such a spectacular lunch. We should give them a big acknowledgement for that. I have suffered through so many bad chicken meals here. Over the years, I can't tell you how grateful I am for this new owner and what they're bringing to us. And of course, local and good food is one of the standards of what we're talking about here today. So back to the Livable Communities Alliance, I want to thank them for their sincere efforts. They have been talking about this and planning and thinking about this for years. And oftentimes, planners are really the backbone of progressive thinking, and a lot of times they don't get the recognition that they deserve. So a big thank you to all of you who are planners and who are involved with this important enterprise. This is an important conversation, and it's happening at all levels of government, locally, certainly at the federal level, and for my part, at the state level as well. I'm one of the legislators. I don't want to pat myself on the back too hard, but I'm one of the legislators who actually gets this. And the critical thing about what we're talking about here with smart growth is that you really need to be in this for the long haul. There's no quick fix here. There's no instant photo op. There's no quick ribbon cutting. There's no instant 100 jobs. This is something you really need to settle in for the long distance to see get done. And you have to forge the relationships and spend the time and develop the trust and get the kinds of partnerships going that these conversations are developing. So we've done the Smart Growth Infrastructure Act. Paul Byers here from the state. We have a position at the State Director of Smart Growth, who's in the Department of State. We've done a bunch of important bills on green building construction, and I've got an effort underway about green schools, the on-bill financing, so many things that mean so much to all of you. We still have a long way to go on getting our historic tax credits through, and the land bank bill that I'm co-sponsoring, and many others that you care about. I would highly advise you to get on the website from our next speaker, smartgrowth.org. I have found the one document that is the State and Regional Policy Guide to be especially helpful in codifying my own thinking on this topic, and it helps us at the state level to use common language with all of you. And what we want to do is to foster that collaborative spirit and do smart investments rather than policies that wind up inhibiting growth instead of smart growth. And I like when they use the expression to develop a preservation vision for the state. And that's something that I have been highly sensitive to. And also to establish principles and a language that we can not only agree to, but communicate across the disciplines. Some of you may know that I was recently appointed chair of the Legislative Commission on Science and Technology, and I have been going all around the state talking about the fact that we have right here in our own community and many others all of the ingredients for an innovation-based economy, one of the premier research institutions, a talent pool, dedicated public servants across the board. None of this will make a bit of difference if we're not making the smart investments in the infrastructure that will attract the people and make it accessible and make it interesting. And it is something that I will promise you I'll go out of my way to marry these two conversations together, the innovation economy along with smart growth. We are very, very lucky to have Geoff Anderson today to speak with us. He is certainly a major light on this topic, a superstar, honestly, who is going to talk about how smart growth development helps with job creation, restoring economic vitality, and reducing government costs. And honestly, in these days, given our new fiscal realities, I'm hoping more people will be open to these ideas as we move forward. Let me tell you a little bit about Geoff. He's the president and CEO of Smart Growth America. He came to his current position in January of 2008 after 13 years at US EPA, where he headed the agency's Smart Growth Program. And during his tenure at EPA, he was instrumental in creating the agency's Smart Growth Program. He helped found the Smart Growth Network, the New Partners for Smart Growth Conference, and the popular website, which I already advertised, smartgrowth.org. In addition, he provided seed funding for and helped to catalyze the creation of the National Vacant Properties Campaign, the lead for Neighborhood Development Certification Program, and the Governor's Institute for Community Design. He has authored numerous publications which you can learn all about. I've told him I'm going to forego reading all of those. You all know who he is, and I'm sure you're anxious to hear him speak. I'd like to welcome Geoff Anderson.
Good afternoon, everyone. That's your cue. It's all right to respond here. It's really some more technical assistance here. It's great to be here. I've actually done a fair number of talks in New York now, and really enjoy every time I get the opportunity to come up. I want to thank the LCA very much for the invitation to be here. And for having me here to talk about such an important issue right now. All the components of smart growth that I personally have, a tremendous interest in: the quality of life, the health impacts, the environmental impacts, just the array of ways that how we build our communities and live in them, and the ways those affect our lives, just have tremendous personal importance to me. Including the economy and the jobs component. But I think if we are not clear about the importance of the economy and jobs, particularly as was mentioned in the current fiscal and economic climate, many of the other arguments that we may tend to talk about on a more regular basis don't have the salience. They're just not topic one. I mean, if you look at polling right now, it's very evident everyone is on the what do we do about the economy, and what do we do about jobs, and how do we deal with our budget issues. I won't say that we're sort of a leading light at the national level on dealing with our budget issues. I'm not impressed with the quality of the debate at this point. But these are issues that everyone's facing, from the federal government to the state government to the local government. And the interaction of our built environment with some of these issues is not always crystal clear. And I think that it's sort of not surprising that we're a little confused about some of these things. And I hope I can kind of shed a little light on some of the issues. And I think some of the confusion arises because of kind of popular myths or a lack of recognition of some of the things that we've always known to be true and continue to be true. And then some confusion arises because, in fact, things have changed, and things have changed substantially. And if we think about sort of the interactions of the economy and the built environment, that's actually not that surprising. From the Erie Canal to shopping malls, big box indoor malls, like the interaction of our physical infrastructure, of the form of our buildings, of the form of our communities, and the economy have always interacted, and there's always been metamorphosis and change. But that doesn't stop us from being a little confused at even the most fundamental levels. So when we're not really sure even what to do or what the function of a sidewalk is, it's not surprising that we end up with some confusion about some of these broader issues. Here, presumably, we imagine that people are going to go and visit these trees. You won't see any school kids walking up this sidewalk just because, frankly, they don't want to look stupid. So, you know, this is the situation we come in with, and so it's not surprising that there are sort of, you know, a variety of ideas about some of the broader and more hidden interactions that are out there. But I do want to start. I'm going to start on just with a discussion of transportation, because we've had a very recent kind of instance of some of the ideas that are out there around transportation. And so I think it's illustrative of some of our confusion, of some of our unwillingness to even acknowledge what we do know currently. It's important because it's such a critical armature for growth and development. You know, I have a good friend in the development community who I can't run into without him saying, well, you know, transportation drives development. Transportation drives development. So if you ever hear Chris Lineberger, he will tell you that at some point in your conversation. So transportation as an armature for change and for affecting communities and community form is important. And then it's also important because, let's face it, the economy is in fact an interaction between public sector activity and private sector activity. And the public sector only has so many things that the public sector can affect. And the rest is going to be up to the private sector. So setting the table correctly, creating the right kind of framework that enables the private sector to drive the economy is critical. And even in the budget times that we're facing, we will continue to spend money on certain things, and transportation is one of the big ones. And I know that, you know, many states and many localities, that budget is under pressure, but there will still be considerable amounts of money spent there. So that's one of the levers that I think we can be thinking about in the economy, and thinking about what do we do about the economy, is to think about what are the sources of funds and what are the actions that we have at our disposal anyway that aren't new, since new funding isn't going to be likely. How do you use your money better? So I want to talk a little about the stimulus. Because the stimulus, I think, the stimulus provided a whole bunch of money, as everyone knows, and a big chunk of that was about $26 billion in flexible transportation funds. And the idea, you know, and this is one area, and it's of particular importance to me because Congress is currently considering and trying to write a transportation bill, as you all probably know. So we're going to be making some broader policy decisions around this, but there are some fundamental assumptions out there, often in contradiction with one another, that continue to live. So for a lot of people, the transportation bill and transportation money and transportation spending is fundamentally about jobs. It is a jobs bill, it's an infrastructure bill, it has a long history of earmarking. You can regularly hear your representative come back and say, I got, you know, this project for the jurisdiction. And there's a bit of an attitude that it's, you know, and this is true in the policy discussions, if you will, at the federal level, that it doesn't really matter what the money gets spent on. I mean, there's surprisingly little discussion about how we spend the money and where the money goes, and a lot of discussion about how much money are we going to spend and who's going to get it. But in fact, it does matter a lot on how you spend the money, and we'll see that. The stimulus was interesting because we did know a couple things about this. So if your whole mantra for the stimulus was, I want jobs, I just need to spend a lot of money as fast as I can to kickstart the economy, and it'd be great, and I heard this, it would be great if we had a lot of time to really think and be strategic about where to put this money, but we are going off a cliff, folks, and we got to just inject money into the economy, so just spend it however you can. So what we knew going in was, from previous studies, we knew that transit actually tends to create more jobs than road building. We also knew that within the road building category, repair and maintenance tends to create more jobs than building new roads. And that was a relatively well-established fact within the literature. So we knew that going in. So how did states spend their money? Well, this is you know, it's an interesting thing because you see about 59% of the money was used for road preservation projects. You see about 33% of the money going to new road projects. Some significant spending, around 4%, on pedestrian bike facilities and so forth, and then, you know, incredibly little on transit. And they had the flexibility, all states had the flexibility to spend on this. And, you know, if the mantra was jobs, you would have thought there would be this big rush for transit. But I think, in fact, despite what the studies and the numbers show, there is a kind of heuristic that people have, an idea that's stuck in their mind that, you know, guys in hard hats by cones on the highway, that's what a job is. And that's what transportation spending equals. So that's what we knew going in, and that's how they spent the money. The interesting thing was that there was a lot of focus on accountability in ERA. So you actually, unlike the current transportation program, had to do a lot of reporting about how many jobs did you create, what actually resulted from the spending that we did on transportation. And there were some interesting things. So this is the states. This is the states reporting out themselves. So all we did for this study was we basically compiled what they told us. And what they told us was, in fact, that transit created even more jobs for the transit projects that were funded. They created even more jobs than the literature would suggest. So for every dollar you spent on transit, you almost created two jobs compared to just standard road spending. And that transit spent just as fast, because the other thing we often heard was, yes, but we have to spend it now, and transit takes so long. But in fact, that wasn't the case. There wasn't any good data reported out on road repair projects versus new projects, so we didn't have any data to report here, since all we did was the compilation. So that's one set of arguments. And then, you know, we did a whole report. And because our theory was, look, we have to be relevant in this conversation. If we're going to have this conversation and it's going to be totally about jobs and nothing else, we better go and make our argument on a jobs basis. So we did. And the response we got was, as you can see on the left, should this just be about jobs, or should this be about what the economy actually needs? And that is a conversation that I would love to have, that I'm begging to have, that we need to have as communities, as states, as a nation. What does the economy really need? What really adds value? So I just said, amen. That's what we'd love to have, but the political conversation seems to be here, so we'll start it here. Because the reality is that you could have probably created the most jobs by giving everyone a spoon. You know, that would be the entire capital outlay for this, and paying them to go dig holes, half of them to dig the hole and half of them to fill it up, right? That would have probably employed the most people. And then you'd get the maximum number of jobs out of that. But would you have contributed anything to the economy? Of course not. That's not a useful activity. So there are activities that basically have a higher value in terms of creating wealth, in terms of creating spin-off value and so forth in the future. And so we decided, well, let's take a look at that. And there are a couple things that we do know. That we as a country and many of our states within this country are in dire shape when it comes to infrastructure. The state of our infrastructure is terrible. Whether you're talking about our transit infrastructure and the simple number of people who aren't served or aren't served by high quality transit, whether you're talking about the state of our roads and bridges, whether you're talking about our ports, whether you're talking about our freight rail facilities, we have significant gaps that we are just not investing in. And part of the issue, part of the interesting thing is that for instance, in our transit area, in the transit arena, we invest so sporadically that we end up actually exporting a lot of the jobs that come out of that. There is actually a significant supply chain of firms in this country that supply pieces and parts to any kind of new transit operation that we start, but the bulk of it actually goes to Europe, goes to China, goes to other places where they have a consistent stream of investment that goes into transit, such that, because if I'm going to actually create a manufacturing facility, there's got to be a consistent set of customers. And so Europe and Japan and Europe and China and other places have that consistent stream of customers, so that as we sort of in this kind of goofy every now and then make a big investment in transit, they've got the capacity ready to go. But we need a consistent investment in this kind of infrastructure for manufacturers here, for investors here, to make the kind of upfront investment that is required, which is a big upfront capital investment where you need a long-term stream of revenues to actually pay it back. So if we're not going to do that, don't expect to see those manufacturing jobs coming back to the U.S. anytime soon. We also know, notwithstanding the whole supply chain issue of transit, that investments in maintenance and repair are good investments. The road industry will tell you this, that basically, you know, every dollar spent saves you a tremendous number of dollars down the road. Common sense tells you this. If you have a leak in your roof, you fix it before your floor starts warping, right? Because that's going to be a bigger cost later on. So if you can fix it early, I mean, it's sort of the, you know, it's a stitch in time saves 9. And we are not adhering to this at all. Instead, we let our infrastructure get into very bad shape and then pay a heck of a lot to fix it. And not only does it have costs, significant costs on the repair side, but it also has significant costs to us. People driving around, having our alignment thrown out, having damage to our cars that we then have to fix every year, which can add up in the sort of $400 to $700 of additional cost every year. And when you're talking about household median incomes of $50,000, that's not insignificant. So some states actually did put the focus on repair and maintenance. And they did say, you know, we know that we have real issues with a number of our roads and bridges not being in good condition. And in fact, so Vermont and Maine and South Dakota and so forth and Connecticut and if I recall correctly, New York put significant amounts of money, or in some cases all of their money, into just fixing their existing infrastructure. Because they knew, A, that was a good investment right now. That it added value to the things that were around those things that were getting fixed. That a downtown with great roads has more value than a downtown with really terrible roads. So it's not only about the road, it's about the surrounding infrastructure as well and the surrounding public and private investments. They also know that if they built a bunch of new stuff, that was adding an overhang, basically an additional burden to the things that they already had that they couldn't maintain. So you can see here that not everyone necessarily sort of took this into account and acted on it in what would seem like a rational way. And so you had Texas with 59% of their roads not in good condition. And they said, well, we can't keep up with the stuff we have. Let's go add some more. Maybe that'll help. Similarly in Kentucky and other places. And you sort of have to I stand back and wonder, like, what is the rationale here? And so maybe the rationale is that you know, okay, we understand fixing it first and investing in rehab and repair would be a good investment, but maybe we've got some better investments even beyond that, and it's worth it to let these things go downhill. This is just another illustration. This is on the bridges side. The same story plays out. So this is an interesting thing, and this is where I think our thinking has, in some cases, not caught up to reality. And there are some basic things going on here. So that, you know, the assumption that if you build it, it will come. If you put in a new piece of infrastructure, it automatically creates economic activity or draws economic activity to itself. That may have changed significantly over the last several years. So in the 1950s here, you can see that the return on highway investment was actually really high. The 50s and 60s, it was really high. And those were, you know, creating solid returns. We've had a steady decline. As we have built out the interstate system, as we have built out our major roads, we've in fact seen a steady decline in return on investment from those kinds of investments. And it makes sense. It's, you know, it's the laws of diminishing return. The first couple roads were really valuable. They got you places that you couldn't get before. The 28th road that could get me sort of some third way to get to a place that I could have gotten already, but maybe in a little more roundabout way, not nearly as valuable as the first one. And similarly, when you're looking at a region-wide congestion issue, which I don't think is as much a problem here, but in a major metro area like Boston or Washington, D.C. or someplace, when you have a road system that's so built out that even if you add 10 miles of new road, which is really expensive, you're talking about adding 0.0001% to the system. It's hard to actually impact that system when you're adding such a small percentage. On the other hand, we have a very small transit system where a reasonable investment in the transit system might actually add, on a percentage basis, significant service and thus potentially provide you with larger returns. And we can see some of that. There are places that are starting to take a hard look and ask, what are we getting for the public expenditure? What are we getting for public infrastructure investments? What are we getting back? And asking that, fortunately, before they make the investment. Key. So in Cincinnati, for instance, and you can see here, they basically compared 3 scenarios. They said, let's look at new highway capacity, let's look at light rail region-wide, and let's look at bus improvements region-wide. And so they had a total cost here of about $522 million for a region-wide bus system, total cost of about $6 billion for the light rail region-wide, and about 1.2 for the highway capacity. The return on investment, pretty significantly different. Pretty significantly different going to the bus improvement. Now, there are a couple of things that are also interesting here. One is, do you even have $6 billion? So, you know, if this, for the sake of argument, let's say this was an 80% rate of return. Well, if you don't have $6 billion, that's a rate of return of 0 because you can't do it. So, in fact, the really cheap option looks really good because maybe you are actually constrained and don't have a giant capital investment to make, and it actually provides a very high rate of return. Other places have done this as well, and this is, I apologize, it's confusing. I'll try to walk you through this, but it's an interesting study. This was done by McKinsey for Atlanta. And Atlanta has a long history of really growing up and out and lots of economic dynamism over the last several decades and so forth. And so, you know, they've got a very car-oriented place. So they asked McKinsey, and McKinsey's a funny firm. McKinsey is not like me. If I was there, I would do things differently. All McKinsey cares about, if you ask them about economic development, which is what you're asking about here, is how much time did I save? With these investments, how much time did I save? Because that's the only measure of economic value that I will accept for this study. So that's all they looked at here, not anything quality of life fee or health or any of that stuff that we might care about. Just how much time did I save with these different investments? So what they asked themselves is, what if I invest in transportation demand management? Well, that investment cost me about, and that, for those not in wonk circles, that means sort of things like pricing and parking management, other techniques like that. So if I invest basically 0.22 billion, since McKinsey will only work in billions, if I invest $0.22 billion in this, I can get $40 billion of return. So the good news is I might have $220 million if I'm Atlanta. I don't personally have 200. So I can get a tremendous return. I can save people a lot of time with that investment, a ton of time. Then they asked, what if we throw down in a serious way on more roads to try to solve our traffic problems? And they said, all right, that's going to cost you $26 billion. You can get another $40 billion of return for that. So nearly sort of money in, money out. It's kind of close, but you know, you get a little higher than 1-to-1 there. And then you had some folks who really thought that was not enough. They sort of were, I don't know, I guess they were really wed to the way Atlanta had done things in the past and were convinced they could absolutely build their way out of congestion. They thought, if we were really serious and we thought about sort of bizarre flyover ramps and tunnels under Atlanta and all kinds of really extreme measures on the roadside, we could build our way out of this. What would that cost and what would that get us? Turns out to do that, you'd have to spend another $17 billion and you could get a $10 billion return for that. So, you know, it is possible to lose money. It's sort of the old adage of, you know, how do you make $1 million? Start with 10. This is the plan if you really want to go extreme. And then they looked at smart growth options and basically said, well, since we only work in billions, we can't even find a number that's small enough to put on this chart. You know, coordinating land use and transportation, changing zoning, focusing development, just doesn't cost enough for us to put anything other than 0 up here. And you can get $39 billion of return that way. So, you know, it paints an interesting picture. If I'm kind of sitting there and picking off of this menu, some look like really great values to me. And some look like an amount of money that I might actually have, and others don't. And I don't think, you know, and so it's sort of clear what one might do if one were in Atlanta. But the broader point here, I think, is that, you know, absent this kind of evaluation, the default mode of operation there would have been the $26 billion for more roads. I mean, that's what they have been doing on and on. that's where they would have gone, and that's why they did the studies, because you needed some objective observer to really take a look at this, and without sort of a preconceived notion of how it turns out, and give you some different perspective. And we need to do that across transportation and a number of other areas. And we can see what some of the long-term outcomes are. This is kind of an interesting, and my apologies to Cleveland, somewhat depressing set of statistics. That's Cleveland in 1948, and you can punch through this animation here. Cleveland in 2002. So the population in 1950, going off the census there, was about 1.3 million, and the population in 2002 was about 1.3 million. So basically, same number of people over that 50-year period, and just spread out tremendously. So absolutely same number of people, very concentrated in 1948, very spread out in 2002. I didn't have data from TTI that exactly matched these years, but I took what I could in terms of their performance on transportation. And you can see that in 1982, as this sort of pattern was playing out, as this trend was playing out of just spreading people further and further around the region, that they had a peak congestion of about 10% of their driving occurred in peak congestion in 1982. In 2007, 28% occurred. So congestion got a lot worse. A lot more people were driving around in congested conditions. In terms of percent of lane miles that had congestion, you again started with 10% and it went up to 23%. And then they managed to also increase the length of the rush hour from 3 hours a day to 5 hours a day. So from a transportation perspective, if all I care about is transportation, if I care about nothing else, this is clearly worse. The lane miles, we went from 2,400 major roads, 2,400 miles of major roads to about 4,400. So that cost a lot of money. That was a big transportation investment over a long period of time, creating a lot of jobs with an outcome that, at least if all you care about is transportation, was not so hot and not so good. The other thing is that we're going to get into this in a second, but I want to sort of point this out that now we're just going to sort of dial back in time. Woo! So people throughout history have gathered together for community, but also for commerce. Commerce really doesn't happen unless people connect in some way. The basis for commerce is trade between people. There's the competition component, but a lot of that competition also, the end result is cooperation between two parties. I trade you something because whatever you're going to give me is more valuable than the thing I have, and vice versa. So people have to come together, whether it's now electronically or in person. People have always come together to affect trade. And that sort of mixing is where capital can be formed and agglomerated, brought together in large chunks to be able to do things that were bigger, to create concert halls, to create roads and infrastructure than anyone could do by themselves. It's the mixing bowl where ideas are generated, where creativity, different disciplines hit one another, and new things arise as a result. And what we've done here is we have spread that out. And just you can sort of condense this into the idea of even a regional labor pool, for instance. This regional labor pool on the right here is far less accessible. The ability to match talent to jobs on the east side of Cleveland to the west side of Cleveland is highly reduced. So your ability to match labor, to match talent with need, your ability to mix ideas, your ability to have creativity and capital come together in the same place is minimized here. And there are actually some, and these are hard things to quantify. I mean, this is all sort of in some ways ineffable, like what is economic development really? But there are ways of measuring it. This is a graph that isn't intended to actually be read. It's simply a graph of clustering versus patent creation. So after a certain amount of clustering, you see a rapid increase in the number of patents that are granted. There are studies on productivity and clustering that show improvements in productivity by virtue of simply people being closer together. So taking advantage of that has always been part of what's created commerce. Interestingly, in one of the recent studies I saw, there's sort of been a lot of talk about the fact that, oh, now we're all digitally connected and we have the automobile, nobody needs to be near anyone. Interestingly, it's the creative technology folks who are most anxious to be near each other. In a recent study of transit, they're the ones who are grouping in these transit-oriented developments. You'd think they'd be the ones who could be least connected physically. They're always online, they're always typing, they're always tweeting and emailing and whatever else they're doing. But in fact, they want to be close. They want that mix and milieu. And it's true whether you're talking about biotech firms, and there's sort of a famous MIT example where all these where all these technology firms grew up around MIT and clustered and got all kinds of crazy ideas from one another, and people went from firm to firm, and tremendous wealth was created. But it's also true in Dalton, Georgia, the capital of carpets in the United States. And it's an odd thing. I know another place that's looking at a candy cluster. They have a lot of people who make candy. And so they're actually thinking about how do we build on this candy cluster. So whereas in the past, a lot of the drivers for economic development and activity were natural resources. Are you near timber? Are you near a port? Are you the convergence of rivers? Now it's almost, are you have you created something uniquely in this place that now that's the place you need to be near it. So if you can create that cluster and create that buzz and create those connections, then it sort of becomes like the convergence of a couple rivers. Now other people need to be there also in order to realize that. And it has a spatial component. And that spatial component can be fed and deliberately cultured. And of course, this was done famously in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the Research Triangle Park, where you had the convergence of the universities and all of the technology firms there, and all of the activity that happens in Research Triangle Park. Interestingly, they recently created a similar park in North Carolina, but they created it in an entirely urban format. And they, in fact, are trying now to retrofit RTP into a more mixed-use, walkable 24-hour center, because that's the kind of place that actually really drives that kind of mixing. And that's the kind of place that the people who are working in a place like RTP, as I used to, want to live. And I can tell you, when I worked there in 1994, the lunchtime rush hour was hell. I mean, because everything was tiny and segmented, and everyone got in their car to drive to a restaurant, and it took an hour out of all of our day. And that's got a real cost to it. So that kind of clustering is important, and it is that kind of clustering and the physical manifestation of it that is attracting talent. And we've heard about some of this, but I found this incredibly interesting. 64% of people are choosing where they want to live and then trying to find a job. That was in the last census. The data that I've been seeing shows that's actually holding even during this current economy. So place is a competitive factor for attracting talent. What are they looking for? They're looking for a certain attitude. They're looking for openness. They're looking for kind of an open culture. I've got actually, let's go ahead one more. So this was an interesting study done by the Knight Foundation. Social offerings, how welcoming a place is, that's what I was struggling for. So it's sort of attitude towards diversity, it's friendliness, and the physical beauty. Those were the three things. Of 44,000 people who were surveyed for this, those were the things that rose to the top as the things that make a place lovable to people, that they want to stay, that they want to invest in. The mayor of Chattanooga says, a place people want to live is a place people want to invest. A place people want to live is a place people want to invest. If you don't want to be there, you're not going to invest there. There aren't many places that have something so compelling economically, like oil and gas or other factors, that you can withstand creating a really crummy place and expect people to stay. If you've got something like that, they will. I mean, there are mining towns that exist and are total shanties and are terrible to be in, and as soon as the mine goes away, the town goes away, because there hasn't been anything sustainable to keep it around. Another factor here that we've heard some about, and I won't dwell on, is just the cost of living. And there's a big difference between places where you have to drive a lot and places where you don't. And you can see this. There's about a 35% difference in vehicle miles of travel when places in metro areas where you have to drive a lot and places you don't. And for instance, in Portland, just because they average 8 million miles less per year in aggregate, that saves them about $1 billion. So that's $1 billion that's free and walking around that economy, just looking for places to invest, looking for things to buy. You can hear on the radio every day, basically, gas prices are high, it's dampening down discretionary income, that's dampening the consumer market, that's slowing the economy down. These are places that are giving themselves their own stimulus. And as gas prices go up, they're going to be at a greater and greater competitive advantage. This is just to show, you know, I didn't realize this till I started geeking out in this field, but 18% on average, we spend 18% of our income, of our household income on transportation. This hits poorer households particularly hard, and if I've got another graph that I'm not showing here, but eventually you hit a point with some of those very low income households where you're basically subsidizing it. So it becomes, either through housing vouchers or other things, it becomes basically a public tax issue, because, in part, because they're paying so much for transportation. This is not meant to be read, it is meant to be read just directionally. There have been a ton of studies, and we're kind of shifting gears now to the public side. There have been a ton of studies that basically have all looked at the same general set of things. What if we grow one way, what if we grow in another? And consistently they find if you grow in a more compact, mixed-use fashion, you save a lot of money. All those studies show all the same things. For instance, in Charlottesville, just in terms of, and this is Charlottesville, Virginia, just in terms of roads, you end up spending either $1 billion for your for your dispersed scenario or $470 million for your town center scenario. Sacramento, finding the same things. They did a really extensive blueprint process based on originally sort of Envision Utah's ideas. Also, like Envision Utah found, they save a garbage load of money every time they keep the development more compact, use the land more efficiently, get the maximum return on their infrastructure investments. We're a funny, like we always say, government should operate like business, but we don't at all. Business, when they put in a massive capital investment, they want to get the maximum return on it. We have whole downtowns where the roads sit, you know, for 12 hours a day, completely unused. 24/7 places make consistent use not only of the public infrastructure, but of the private sector investments. You have places that are trying to get by on just a lunch trade, while you've got some other place out in the suburbs trying to get by on a dinner trade. If you can get that in the same place, it's more efficient. These reiterate some of the same points, and given the time, I'm going to go through some of them quickly. Putting individual increments of development in urban infill costs a lot less from the public perspective. It also generates a lot higher revenue per acre. So if you can get a 4-story mixed use, the kinds of development that Jonathan Rose is building, those are great for your tax rolls. They're using existing infrastructure, they've got a lot of units, and they provide a lot of tax return. If you're putting them out on the edge, it's a different story, and they start to return less. So in Asheville, they recognize this, and in and putting a significant amount of public money and effort into renovating and restoring some of their downtown, it's turned it into long-term return on investment on a tax basis every single year. Dispersed development consistently finds what we found in big picture, and that is that you pay $1.65 for every dollar you're getting back in Colorado. In Loudoun County, Virginia, you can read this yourself, but there was a Republican county councilman who used to say, every time we approve a new subdivision, we're approving a tax increase. Every time we're approving a new tax increase. So you can see here the difference between even just the infill townhouse and infill multifamily. Basically, it's in some ways getting townships, cities, counties to look at their land actually as a valuable asset. How do I maximize the return on the asset? In some ways, it's getting them to look at it more like a long-term developer. I'm in it for the long haul. I'm the long-term landowner here trying to get a rate of return over time, a consistent rate of return over time. If you ask the ULI and their emerging trends in real estate, they show the same thing every time. And I've got a slide on this later, but it basically is people investing for the long term who don't want to just build and flip and get out, but who want a consistent stream of revenue that rises over time, they invest in smart growth communities. These are the kinds of outcomes that are making localities really stand up and pay attention. This is Arlington County, just outside of Washington, D.C. The county actually is mostly low density. This is basically this corridor here where they oriented a lot of development around our major metro system infrastructure investment here. That's about 7% of the county's land area. So they've got a ton of stuff that looks a lot more standard and usual, but it accounts for about 35% of their revenues. So this is their cash cow, and everyone else is just sitting pretty with very low tax revenue, with very low tax rates and very high tax revenues, enjoying the benefits that this provides. They're also, of course, enjoying the proximity and convenience that they have, even if they're not living right inside it, because you can't support that kind of retail, you can't support that kind of culture, and you can't support those kinds of services if you don't have that kind of compactness. They have that, that provides that, and then a lot of people get to live just outside and enjoy it being nearby. I'm going to just close very quickly with a kind of reiteration of some of the earlier points, but maybe with the development market is changing. And we need to understand this because it's an important sector of the economy. Again, I'll quote Chris Lineberger. He likes to say, you know, we've led the last 2 recessions. The development industry has led two of the last 3 recessions. So in the early 90s, it was real estate. Early 2000s, it was the tech bubble. Now again, it's real estate. If we get this wrong, it's a big problem because we can actually reduce the value of existing stocks and continue to drive ourselves into a hole. You get it right, you actually can create value out of thin air. And just to show what I mean by that, if you infill here, and we know that housing in proximity to retail has some extra value, if you infill retail here, you're not only creating the value of the retail, you're adding value to everything around that, which is a way to bring up the entire tax base. If you put this out by itself, it leverages nothing. It leverages nothing if it's by itself, but if you put it in a way where it can actually provide additional revenues and create some spin-off effects on others, then you can get additional value out of it. The market is changing. You know, these are a lot of the demographics. We put together a little forum with about 45 national home builders and said, all right, we had this real estate firm do a study to basically find out how much of the market wants smart growth. They found a third. We're here, you know, to ground truth that with all of you. And the guy raises his hand and he says, that's just not right. It's not a third. And I said, all right, well, that's why we're here. I'm glad we're having this open process. And I said, what's wrong with it? And he said, oh, it's much higher than that. I said, oh, okay. Well, how much higher? And he kind of looked around. And he's like, I'm not telling, because those were all his competitors. So the real estate market is recognizing this. The demographic trends are driving it. You've heard about, you know, the silver tsunami, as they like to call it in Minnesota. We're all getting older. You might feel very much older during this speech. You know, but this is going to have major impacts on the, you know, the baby boomers have determined culture and markets throughout their time on this earth. They will continue to do so, along with the millennials. You saw the earlier graph. The millennials are neck and neck for the size of the bubble they're moving through the economy. They both are going to be wanting different things. Okay, so we have major changes. Single households, one individual in a household, will have the same number of households as households with kids by 2025. That has real implications for housing. So this was a study done by Chris Nelson. He's now at the University of Utah. He basically said, all right, let's look at the demographics. In 2003, what's our supply of large lot, small lot, single family, and attached housing? And you can see that in 2003, there's the supply. Then he projects the demand in 2025. You can see the big yellow bar, that's large lot, single family housing. We already have today on the ground in the United States, or did in 2003, the number of large lot single family houses that will be demanded in 2025. So you can decide, well, these markets are regional, that's somewhere else, and take that chance and roll those dice if you like. But if you get it wrong, not only are you facing the potential failure of all those, you know, and we've seen a lot of this, obviously, of all those subdivisions and all those housing projects, But they put a huge drag on your existing stock and all existing homeowners, because we know those houses go into competition with everything else that's in the market and can drive down the entire market. In contrast, we're seeing premiums for the things that are undersupplied. Walkable, mixed-use communities, so there's a thing called Walk Score. You can look it up. It's pretty cool. You can type in your address, get a Walk Score out. If you do that over and over and check prices, you basically find out, oh, wow, the places that actually have really great walkability right now are getting premiums. You can see that from the 1990s, when cities were dead, they've consistently grabbed greater market share of new construction permits and development up till 2006. If you look, I don't have the data beyond 2006. Sorry. If you look at foreclosure trends, the centers, the places that are mixed use, walkable, 24/7 places, they're the places holding their values, and the values tend to drop as you go out. You can see that over and over in places Boston and DC and Miami and so forth. This is the emerging trends in real estate report I was referring to. The Urban Land Institute every year, along with PricewaterhouseCoopers, I believe, does a survey and basically asks people who are investing large amounts of money in real estate, where are you going to invest? And basically for the last 11 years, I just get bored of reading it. It says the same thing, but in different ways, so you read it again. So it says, coastal places with access to great markets, stay away from fringe development, go downtown, go near transit, go walkability. Those are the places we're going to invest. And to some degree, it doesn't matter if they're right or wrong. They're the ones with the money. If they believe this, that's where they're going to put their money. You can sort of be available for the Jonathan Roses of the world. I mean, these are the people that they're interviewing, Jonathan Rose. You can be available for them and be attractive for them, or you can make it hard and they'll go find some other market where it will work. You can see the builders are, in fact, recognizing this trend and moving this way. This is, more specifically not national, but mid-Atlantic region. 60% are saying we got to shift away. They're looking at multifamily and so forth. And then, this is the net result when you sort of put together intelligent investments in infrastructure, when you think about your economy and your economic niche and intentionally fostering and trying to grow particular clusters, providing the physical infrastructure and design environment in which those are going to thrive. As the mayor of Davidson, North Carolina says, it's awfully easy to become pretty well off, and then we start having to worry about housing affordability. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I appreciate the time, and thank you all. And I'd be happy to take questions, I believe.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, 5 minutes of questions. Someone ask a really long question.
I'm going to ask a question that I believe some not far from me would ask, which is that in this area, once you leave the city of Binghamton, we're talking about rural issues in connection with smart growth, and the whole transportation issue looks a little bit different.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about ways in which smart growth can look different.
So I'm actually really concerned about rural areas, and this was certainly brought up earlier, but they are the places where in many cases people have driven to qualify. So they were at the edge of being able to afford whatever house they're in. Presumably they drove till it was cheap enough to get a house in some cases. And then, they're at the greatest mercy to gas price increases. I mean, you are absolutely locked in, and your choice is to not take the trip or to pay the money. But you have no alternatives besides that. And then when you add on and overlay the silver tsunami and the possibility for people really being stranded, it's a picture that certainly has economic implications, but I also think just very basic quality of life and questions that are really value-laden for us as a society about how we want people to be able to participate in communities, to be able to reach family and friends. We have Social Security because we made a statement as a nation about the kinds of quality of life we wanted our older Americans and mothers and fathers to have. I think that is potentially in jeopardy again. In Montana, they started a bus route basically connecting many small towns in highly rural parts of Montana, And there was sort of a big argument about whether that was a worthwhile investment. And I think they were projected to get maybe 200 riders in the first month, and they got 1,000 in the first week. So, there's often an assumption that when it comes to transportation, transit is entirely an urban issue. It's not actually. It has a rural manifestation, a rural component, and a rural application that can actually be a real lifeline. In major metro areas, you're talking about transit as an alternate means of dealing with congestion. In rural areas, it's a basic issue of access. It's a basic issue of, can you get to your dialysis or not for some people? Because, the problem isn't that the road isn't there in some cases. The problem is that you can't drive or you don't have a car. So with respect just to transportation, I think, that's what I would say. I think there are different kinds of transit. We have some problems at the federal level where you sort of have to be the right kind of disabled to access different kinds of transit. So we'll start a transit program for vets. We'll start one for Medicaid, and so forth. We need to bring those together and rationalize them and just say, look, people need to get around these areas. You don't have to be a particular category to be able to access this service, and it'll be more efficient and more cost-effective to deliver it that way. On the land use and development side, Matt showed the picture of small town. New York has a great history of very small places coming together and developing and growing up in very smart growth patterns. And I do think it's really the sort of New York, New England small town that's the model for a lot of this. And in some ways, that's what, in fact, we seek to emulate in places like Washington, D.C. I don't live the entire District of Columbia metro area. I live in a very small town in D.C. It's encompassed by my neighborhood, my 20-minute walk to work, the grocery stores that are right around it, and in some ways, the smarter growth it gets, the smaller my town gets. I would wager you don't venture beyond 7 blocks outside of your 374 square feet for the most part. So that in fact is the model. It's the rural towns that are the model. And Matt put his finger on it when he said, the economic reason for being has to, we have to figure that out. And I think we've done a terrible job with rural economic development. I mean, to me, that is essentially amounted to how can we suburbanize it or urbanize it. And what we need is to honor and recognize the fact that there are rural economies and they need investment, but it would be a totally different kind of investment if you were actually trying to help the rural economy rather than trying to transition it to a suburban or urban one. And that the idea of just get more stuff as an economic development strategy is bankrupt. The first rule of holes is stop digging. So I think we have to recognize that there are some things that don't help. There is some development that does not help you. And I tried to illustrate that fact that if it is actually detracting from the existing places and either reducing housing values for the region as a whole or shifting retail around the region without actually, if it's just shifting activity around the region rather than actually building activity, that's just a waste. So the first thing I would say is make sure you stop that. The second thing is that governments often react to proposals. And the position you really want to be in is you want to be leading, you want to be sending a really clear signal to the private sector about what you want as a community, what you want as a place, and making the investments that send that signal. Because the private sector lives and breathes off of leveraging public sector investment. It's the public sector investment that creates the initial value proposition that the private sector, at least in development, follows along. So if you can create that and send clear signals with where and how you're investing your public investment, that can make a big difference. I would, if I were you all, I would be taking a serious look at the university and trying to understand, what is it that those kids are interested in? Raleigh's sort of fresh in my mind because I was with the director of economic development from Raleigh yesterday. They have a whole video gaming cluster. We've got like 20 firms that do nothing but develop video games. that is straight out of UNC and Duke and NC State. I mean, that's straight out of those places, and the interest. So trying to look at sort of what are your economic activities now, how do you link that in with some of the other resources that may not be tapped in terms of the university? I mean, the connection that North Carolina has managed to bridge between their university system and the private sector it really is something that you should look at. And you're not going to stitch it together in the same way they have, but I think it would provide real food for thought. So intelligent use of the things you do control, making sure that you don't go after everything and anything because they're not all created equal. Looking at the assets that you do have, and then figuring out a way. I mean, I got to say, I didn't realize I was a 50-minute flight from Binghamton in D.C. It's a beautiful place. If there were sort of activities that that I couldn't get, which I'm sure there are, from DC, I think it has potential as a tourist place. So thinking about, and I was just in Spain. We took an agricultural tour, and that was just because someone had set up a thing to take tours. And so, just thinking about, in some ways, looking at it from an outsider's perspective and asking yourself, what's unique and special and interesting here? How do we celebrate it? How do we celebrate it in a way that's great for the people who are here? Because if a place is great for people who are there, other people want to come and check it out. I mean, that's the bottom line. So in some ways, the best thing you could ever do if you were after a tourist industry would be make this a great place in and of itself. And then finally, on the interjurisdictional competition, it takes strong leadership against very high odds. But if you fight amongst yourselves, you're going to lose. I think you have to ask yourself, how is that working? Do we like what we're getting now? And is more of the same likely to come up with a different outcome? And if you don't like what you're getting now, someone had better do something different, because doing the same thing, everybody knows this, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity. It's not easily solved, but the places that are getting their act together and working regionally and understanding, I'm in a global competition here. I mean, the game has changed, and I can't afford these petty arguments about moving one business half a block to get beyond some artificial line that only, determines tax base. You're going to be left behind.
Sir, Lois Andrasik with the Greater Binghamton Association of Realtors. We have a transportation problem on Strat Mill Road, about a quarter of a mile from the corner of Colesville and Strat Mill. There's housing for the elderly and a certain income level, but they have no way of getting to doctor's appointments or getting into town. However, a bus goes to the Kirkwood Industrial Park, turns right, where it could turn left onto Strat Mill Road and pick up, I was talking to a couple of women, they said they have a tough time getting in for doctor's appointments. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if maybe once a week the bus went there and took the women to the Oakdale Mall and let them walk or shop for a couple of hours and then take them back, because I have seen the bus travel empty. And yet they feel they're strapped. They love the area, they love where they're at, but they can't get into town.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's hard for me to, a lot more about the local situation than I do, but I think it's fair to say that, the transit systems I'm familiar with, are often not perfect and can be looked at for, better ways to do things. Fundamentally, what we'd really like to get to is thinking about that ahead of time. Where are seniors going to live in a way that they can be independent? Because it's nice to go to the mall once a week, but if they're like anybody here, we like to get out more than once a week, and we like to go multiple places, and we like to do it on not at the mercy of a bus schedule determined by someone who's not me. And so the idea that we would create housing without thinking about who's going to live there and what they're going to need, particularly when cars aren't going to be an option for everyone at all stages, in their living there, is a problem. And I think, I would really hope to try to even start earlier. I mean, you've got the situation you have now, and you have to find a way to address it. But you know, it's really fundamentally a land use problem to start with and a development problem.
I actually wanted to just make a comment about the first question that was asked, and I think in central New York, people aren't necessarily driving to qualify, right? We live in rural communities because we're making a choice. But in response to the issue that you just raised, I think that the answer has to do with the clustering of amenities and walkability. And I'm wondering, in terms of transportation investments in the rural context, can we think about slowing traffic on the main streets? You know, can we think about creating more walkable communities, having more money for sidewalks and things like that? I think that's part of the answer, because you need places, you need to be able to walk, and then you need places to walk to. And so it would be great if those rural issues were a part of the national debate, and they are to some degree, but I think that the major metropolitan areas and the significant congestion and issues and sprawl that you have to deal with there sort of overpower some of these really basic things. And I think it's relatively simple. Some of these things can be relatively simple fixes by the clustering of uses and creating more walkable communities.
Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is sort of in the weeds, but there is a transportation grant program called the Tiger Program that is coming out with its third round. About a third of it, which is I think 115, 120 million, something like that, is reserved for rural communities. And we're actually, Smart Growth America is going to be going around and trying to work with rural communities to help them develop applications for that would look at exactly those kinds of approaches. So I think that's exactly right. And it is, you know, it is a lot of the issues, you know, they're real in rural places, and they just demand a rural context solution. But the solutions are there to be had. So thank you all very much.